It was about 25 years ago. It was a hot August day in a double wide in Columbia, Missouri. My sister and I and our cousins, we were spread out all across the living room, on the floor, on the couches, and Grandma was holding session. She was telling us a story that we had never heard. She said, "Kids, your grandfather and I had just arrived on the mission field. In fact, we were at the mission station in Sudan, Africa, when your grandfather caught malaria." And she said it wasn't very long before the leaders of the station came up to us and said, "We have absolutely given all the medication that we have available." And we're just watching her and we're just listening, right? Wide-eyed, open-mouthed, because we'd never heard the story of when Grandpa had caught malaria, when all the medication was gone. And she said, "I stood there that night. I put one hand on his head. He was in and out of consciousness and he was sweating." And she said, "I stretched the other hand toward heaven and I began to pray, 'Father, this is not what I want. This is not what we planned for. We just recently got married and answered your call to go on this mission together halfway across the world. But Lord, if you choose to take Glenn home to be with you this evening, come tomorrow morning, I will stay here and I will complete the mission to which you've called us.'" Now, in that moment, in that faith-filled moment, my grandmother had no idea that before daybreak, his fever would break. Before the end of the night, there would be a new beginning, a fresh start. She had no idea in that defining moment of faith that they would spend 14 years serving on the continent of Africa together and decades serving in the States as pastors. In that moment when I heard her story, my grandmother became a hero of the faith to me. I want to invite you guys into the hall of faith. Hebrews chapter 11. But before we go there, think about the other halls that you've been in. Halls of fame, whether it's sports or music. Go with me for just a moment into a hall of fame that's all about sports. It's about plays, but it's also about plays in a quarter and in a half and for the whole game. And it's not just that game, but it's the season and it's the ups and the downs and it's that person, but it's teamwork and it's about building and it's about momentum and it's about perseverance. Yes, moments of brilliance and clarity and creativity as this player does this and does that and just shines. But it's also about blood, sweat, and tears. It's also about perseverance and endurance. That's why we walk the halls of fame, to read the stories and to watch the clips and to be mesmerized and amazed again at what a human being can do when a human being sticks with it and uses his God-given or uses her God-given talents to finish the game well, to finish strong. Walk with me through a music hall of fame and listen to the notes. The notes strung together into songs on albums, and the drummer up and quit, but they still stayed with it. And somewhere in the middle of the tour, the guitarist didn't show up, but they kept riding the waves and riding through the storm and writing and playing and showing up. It's 12 people now listening to their music somewhere, and now all of a sudden they're filling stadiums and amphitheaters, and people are resonating, connecting with their songs. And we walk through the Hall of Fame and read their story and listen to their music. Why? Because there's something enduring about it. There's something that's connecting. And I think as you begin to peel away the layers, it's not just the person, it's the commitment behind. It's the commitment that's underneath, that's undergirding, the perseverance, the ability to stick with it, to keep writing, to keep being creative, to stay faithful. Now go with me into the Hebrews Hall of Faith. Hebrews chapter 11, a number of stories recounting the lives of a number of people who made a difference. Faithfulness doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen over a lifetime. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4 says this of Abel, that though he is dead, he still speaks by his faith. Or to put it the other way around, his faith still speaks even though he is dead. And I love that. My grandmother died over 2 decades ago. But every single time I think of her, her faith speaks. It shouts, it encourages me and stirs up my faith. She no longer walks this earth, but absolutely her faith continues to help me to run the race marked out for me. Now that's the Hall of Faith, and that's the power of these lives. decades ago, centuries ago, millennia ago, these guys and gals lived, but their faith still stirs, it still speaks, and it still encourages us and motivates us toward lives of faithfulness. Because that's what faithful lives are all about. A man of valor is faithful, but faithful doesn't happen overnight, it happens over a lifetime. And a faithful life is made up of faith-filled moments, those defining moments when we make choices, as did my grandmother that night, before anything resolved, before the sun rose, before her husband, before the fever broke and they served together. She resolved in that faith-filled moment to say, God, I'm trusting you. God, I'm trusting you to lead the way into an unknown future, and I am looking to you. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10 tell one of the stories of Abraham. It says that Abraham, when called by faith, when called to go to a place that he would later inherit, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. Now, who of us can't relate with that? Sometimes the Lord calls and we don't know where, exactly how or where we're going. But he obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. And then the text tells us that he lived in the promised land. He made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign land. Well, what does that mean? Well, the next verse says that he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs of the same promise with him. And then it tells us kind of the why behind it, like, and the how. How did you do that? Why did you keep going, Abraham? Why did you keep every night pitching tents? You were heading to the promised land, but you were pitching tents. You were living there like a stranger, like a foreigner in a foreign country. How did you do that? Why were you doing that? And the Bible tells us in Hebrews 11:10, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. I mean, just imagine the family. They're clearing the space. They're putting the stakes in the ground. They're setting up the tent for another night and another day and another night. And on they continue on the journey. But where are their eyes? Their eyes are focused forward. Because faithfulness doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a lifetime of faith-filled moments where even though I'm putting up the tent, I'm looking forward to what God is continuing to do. God has promised this, and so I'm going to keep it that, but I'm going to keep my eyes focused where God is calling. And he kept his faith focused forward, even as he put out the tents. A little later in the chapter 11 of Hebrews, verses 24 through 26, say that by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with God's people. Now, why would he do that? He chose to be mistreated along with God's people. And then it goes on to say that he regarded disgrace for Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. What is that about? Well, the verse tells us. Verse 26, for he was looking ahead to his reward. You see, all the shining treasures, he could have looked there, but instead he chose to turn his focus toward what was ahead. He was looking ahead to his reward. Like Abraham, who was looking forward to the city with foundations while he's building a tent, here's Moses with every temptation, every reason to turn this way or to turn that way or to just stop moving altogether. But instead, he like a sharpening of his focus, he is looking ahead to his reward, not being tempted, not being drawn away by the treasures of Egypt, which were his. He could have taken those. He could have accumulated those. He could have made his life all about those. But instead, the hall of faith shows us, and Hebrews 11 tells us that he chose to look ahead to his reward. So what does this mean for our lives? As we turn the page into the next chapter, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 say this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Now, who's that talking about? Well, that's talking about Abraham. That's talking about Moses. That's talking about my grandmother, Ruth. We are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, let's think about that for just a second. As we think about running a race, you talk about focus and you talk about persistence and endurance, and it's one foot in front of another. A race isn't one just like that. A race is one step by step, football by football, but faithful focus. And so Hebrews says to just throw off everything that hinders, that would keep us from running the race. and the sin that so easily entangles. I imagine something wrapping around my feet, now my ankles, now my knees, keeping me literally from moving forward, from running. Now I'm stumbling, and I remember the day I raced David. Now David was one of my cousins who was in the room when Grandma was telling us her faith story. And David was, we were probably around 15 years old. David was, he was just on track to get a scholarship to run. He was fast. He was track and country. He was sprint. He was quick. And everybody in the family knew it except for me, because what I did know at 15 was everything. I thought I knew everything. I thought I could take my cousin David. And so I talked to everybody. They're trying to talk me out of it. Todd, are you sure he's really fast? I'm like, no. And so I talked everybody into going into this back alley, and some of my family went to the finish line and others stayed back here. We had family lining each of the sides, and someone from way down there said, on your mark. And I got down, get set, go. And all of a sudden I pushed off the ground, and David pushed off, and he began to kick, and all of a sudden he kicked up all of this dust, and I couldn't see in front of me. And when the dust began to clear and the dust began to settle, I saw about halfway through the race, I saw my cousin cross the finish line. And I look back on that day that feels like a long time ago and yesterday all at the same time, because I still remember what was going on. Man, I had some things that were hindering me and had nothing to do with athletic ability. Now, he was quicker, he was faster, he was athletically more superior. But the main thing that was holding me back on that day at 15 was my inflated sense of ego. It was too heavy for me to run, was my own pride. I was carrying too much of that because I had to prove myself to myself and to everybody gathered around. Look at me, watch what I can do. I can win the race. And I wish I could tell you that were the only time in my entire life that I've ever tried to run the race with baggage. And so Hebrews says, just throw it aside. And then it goes on to say, you run the race with perseverance, run the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Now I want to come back to that in just a minute. Hebrews 12 goes on to say, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him, says Hebrews 12:3, consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So here's what I want to show you, because all of us are tempted to grow weary and lose heart. And all of us at times face the temptations to let things tangle us up, to let things hinder us from making progress on this journey, on this road, on this race of faith. But here's what I've seen, and I can't unsee it. And that is that right in the middle of that, those admonitions, throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and don't grow weary and lose heart. Right in the center of that is fixing our eyes on Jesus. It's my grandmother looking to an uncertain future, but instead of looking just into that future, she also looks up and says, Lord, I'm trusting that you will lead me into that future, even if you take Glenn home tonight. It's Abraham building the tent, but not just staying there, but continuing to move forward and to focus forward toward the future that God had promised. It's Moses. He could have stayed back. He could have just enjoyed the treasures. He could have just coasted, but instead he was looking ahead. It's everything to do with focus. Faithfulness, guys, does not happen overnight. It happens over a lifetime as we focus our faith, have those faith-filled moments, moment by moment. So fixing our eyes on Jesus. Now, I was reading again not too long ago, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring. Now, it's early in the book, written by this author, but also this Christian. And so we have to watch, because as we're reading, as we're getting into the story, we're going to run into some truth here. We're going to stumble over some truth that's intentionally there to get us thinking, to stretch our way of thinking and living. Now, here early on in this journey, early in the story, we've got Pippin and Sam. And Pippin and Sam, and they've just started the journey with Frodo, and they're making their way to Mordor, the last place in Middle-earth they want to be, and the only place they have to be. That's where their mission is taking them. That's where their mission will be resolved. And so together, step by step and day by day, they're making their way to Mordor. But early on in the story, early on in the Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien writes that Pippin exclaims, the road goes on forever, but I can't without rest. It is high time for lunch. And then he writes that Pippin sat down on a bank by the road, and he began to look into the east, into the haze, across which lay the river, and the end of the shire in which he had spent all his life. Then Tolkien says that Sam stood by him, and that Sam's round eyes were wide open, for he was looking across lands he had never seen to a new horizon. I love that. If we had time, we could grab a cup of coffee and sit across the table and talk about one of the things I think Tolkien is pointing out here is that the road does go on and on and on and on and on, but we can't without rest and provision. So on the journey, we have to take care of ourselves. If we had time, we could talk about that incredible phrase, Sam stood by him, and what it means to not journey alone, to not take this step by step, day by day, faith-filled moment by faith-filled moment, leading into a faithful life alone, but how together we encourage and together we take this journey. If we had time, we could talk about what it means to receive the Sams that God places in our lives and to be a Sam to others along the way. But here's what I want to take time for. Here's what I don't want you to miss as we begin to turn the corner here toward the close, and that is this. Notice where both Pippin and Sam's eyes were. They were not looking back where they were coming from. They didn't look back to the Shire in which they had spent their entire lives. Instead, Pippin's looking into the haze, because sometimes it's a bit fuzzy, the future. We're not sure exactly. Abraham obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. And Sam, well, his round eyes were wide open. Why? Because he was looking across lands he had never seen. And then that phrase, to a new horizon. Gentlemen, as we consider what it means to be men of valor, men who are faithful, and we remember that faithfulness doesn't happen overnight. Faithfulness is the accumulation. It is the sum total of a faith-filled moment here, plus a faith-filled moment there, and there, all along the way, step by step, all along the journey, fixing our eyes on Jesus. And so what does it mean to be a faithful husband? Well, as we find our eyes beginning to wonder, keep in mind that a wondering eye eventually leads to a wondering heart. So when we find ourselves, our eyes beginning to wander this way or that way, we fix our eyes on Jesus. Why? Because he's not finished with us yet. He's still growing us. Our faith is still maturing, but that happens as we not let our eyes wander, but as we focus on him, fixing our eyes on Jesus. As Christian fathers, how do we not try to take shortcuts or try to just resolve things too easily and too quickly when we know that good parenting doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a lifetime. Well, how do we do that? We fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, because he's still growing our faith and he's still growing us as husbands and as fathers, as neighbors, as co-workers, as citizens of the kingdom. God isn't finished. A man of valor is faithful. And little by little, day by day, that's happening. We are becoming faithful men of God, faith-filled moment by faith-filled moment of fixing our eyes on Jesus.